Your kids don't belong here." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I swear, for a moment, the entire room went silent. My 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, shrank behind my leg, and my 4-year-old son, Ethan, clutched my skirt like it could protect him from the storm. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just exploded out of my sister's mouth. Laura, my younger sister by 2 years, was staring at me, eyes sharp, mouth set in that smug line she always wore when she thought she was right. Her daughter, Clara, was bouncing happily near the cake table, completely oblivious to the tension, while the other parents looked at each other, unsure if they should intervene or just pretend nothing had happened. And Mark, my husband, he sat there for a beat too long before standing, and in that moment, I realized this party would never be the same. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. I keep thinking back to that morning. We'd spent hours getting Sophie's new dress ready, brushing Ethan's hair so it wouldn't stick up in every direction, and packing snacks for both kids to take to the party. I even brought a small gift for Clara, my sister's daughter, hoping this gesture would soften the edge of our strained relationship. Little did I know it wouldn't matter. Nothing mattered. Because by the time we walked through the door, Laura had already decided she didn't want my children there. And she didn't just say it quietly. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want you to understand the stakes here. Sophie and Ethan are good kids, innocent, playful, loud when they're excited, shy when they're unsure. They've never caused trouble at school or in the neighborhood." And yet, my own sister, someone who should have been thrilled to see her nieces and nephews enjoying a party, had decided in that exact moment that they were unwelcome. Can you imagine feeling that kind of rejection in front of your children? The shame alone is crushing. And the humiliation? Well, that's something that sticks in your chest like a heavy stone. Guests froze. Some of them glanced at me, probably wondering if I was going to lose control. Others whispered to each other, eyes darting back and forth between the children and Laura. And my children? Sophie's bottom lip quivered as she tried to shrink into my side. Ethan's tiny fingers twisted into the fabric of my dress. They were embarrassed, confused, scared. I could see it in their eyes. They didn't understand why their aunt, someone they had always looked up to, would say something so cruel. And I couldn't explain it to them, not yet. All I could do was pull them a little closer and hope that my heart didn't break in front of everyone. Mark finally stood, and the tension in the room shifted. Not because he yelled or shouted, but because he was calm, unshakable, and a little dangerous. He pulled out his phone and said, "Should I read the court report?" Everyone froze again, but this time it wasn't just shock, it was disbelief. What court report? Our neighbors, our friends, even Laura's husband, Richard, looked on like they had just stumbled into a courtroom drama without warning. You could hear a pin drop. The laughter from earlier had completely vanished. The kids, sensing the seriousness, froze mid-step. Sophie clutched my arm harder, and Ethan whimpered softly, looking up at Mark as if he were some kind of hero about to save us all. I'm sure you're asking yourself, what court report? Why would Mark bring that up at a kid's birthday party? And trust me, I was asking the same thing in that instant, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. But I knew one thing, whatever he was about to do would change everything. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a party anymore. This was about history, old grudges, family secrets, and the truth that Laura had been hiding, or maybe even trying to bury, was about to explode into the open. I keep replaying the room in my head. The balloons hanging crookedly in the corner. The table laden with cupcakes and juice boxes. The bright banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Clara." And in the middle of all that innocence, this storm of words and judgment. I could feel the eyes of the guests on us, the tension wrapping around me like a vice. Every heartbeat felt louder than the last. I wanted to shrink into myself, disappear, erase the whole scene. But I couldn't, not for my children. They were counting on me, whether they knew it or not. And Mark, he had other plans entirely. And here's the thing, the worst wasn't just the words themselves. The worst was the way Laura had timed it. Not in private. Not when just we could talk it out. No, she chose the exact moment when our kids were present, when everyone else could witness, when I had no defense. It wasn't just a slight, it was a public statement of exclusion. And I knew deep down that this wasn't just about a party or her precious daughter's friends. There was something more. Something buried in the past. Something that could turn our lives upside down in ways I hadn't even imagined. Mark tapped his phone lightly, the screen glowing faintly under the party lights. He looked calm, but there was fire in his eyes. And I realized, just as the room fell completely silent, that whatever came next, it wasn't just going to embarrass Laura. It was going to rewrite the story of our family's gatherings forever. Every laugh, every smile, every polite conversation from the past seemed meaningless now. The air felt thick, like we were teetering on the edge of some revelation that could not be taken back. And just when I thought the silence might stretch forever, Mark whispered something so quiet that only I could hear. His words were calculated, precise, almost chilling. Everyone is about to see why this isn't just about a party. And then, he tapped the screen. The room leaned in without knowing it. The children clutched me tighter. Guests held their breath. And Laura, well, her smug expression faltered ever so slightly. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. I wish I could say I handled the moment with grace. I really do. But the truth? I froze. I stood there, heart pounding, cheeks burning, and stared at Laura like she had grown a second head. "They don't belong here," she repeated, this time louder, sharper, as if repeating it would somehow make it truer. And in that moment, I saw the shock on everyone else's faces, friends, neighbors, even her own mother hovering awkwardly near the punch table. Some looked horrified, some looked like they were trying not to laugh at the absurdity. But my kids, Sophie and Ethan, looked crushed. Sophie's little hands curled into fists, pressing against my thighs, and Ethan's eyes welled up with tears. It was humiliation wrapped in words, served hot and right in front of everyone. I had spent the morning imagining the smiles on their faces, the excitement of a birthday party, the sound of balloons popping and kids running around. Instead, I was watching the air thicken like smoke around my children. And I kept asking myself, why now? Why in front of everyone? Was it because Laura had some secret grudge, or was it just her way of showing off how perfect she thinks her life is? Mark, as usual, was the calm in the storm. He leaned down to Sophie and whispered something reassuring, then lifted Ethan into his arms. I could feel his presence radiating strength. He wasn't panicking. And yet, beneath that calm, there was a fire I hadn't seen before, a warning that things were about to escalate. I had learned long ago not to interrupt that fire. Mark had a way of handling situations that made people think twice before crossing a line, and everyone at the party could feel it now. Laura, of course, didn't care. She was on a roll. Her voice carried across the room, loud enough to reach the neighbors outside. "I'm sorry, Emily, but your kids don't fit in here. This is Clara's special day," and she paused dramatically, giving the other parents a wink, as if she were daring them to side with me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her she had no right. But instead, I found myself hugging my kids tighter, trying to shield them from the sting of her words. And then Mark did something I'll never forget. He stood. Slowly, deliberately. The kind of movement that makes everyone else in the room pause and pay attention. And in that moment, I felt a shift, an almost tangible shift in the air. The room fell silent. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the party lights. And then he said it. "Should I read the court report?" I swear, the sound of that phrase hit harder than Laura's original words. Guests froze mid-conversation, some turning their heads to look at him in disbelief. Laura herself froze, her mouth slightly open, her smug expression faltering just enough for the first crack of uncertainty to show. A few people whispered, "Court report?" "What court report?" The tension in the room thickened with every second. I felt a flicker of fear. What if Mark was going too far? What if this ruined everything? But then I saw the small glint of authority in his eyes, the quiet confidence, and I realized he wasn't threatening, he was exposing. He wasn't just defending us, he was about to reveal a truth that would leave everyone speechless. And somehow I knew it would be perfectly calculated, precise, and unforgettable. I looked down at Sophie and Ethan. They were frozen, staring up at Mark with wide eyes, and I whispered to them softly, trying to calm them, though I could feel my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. "It's okay," I said. "Daddy's going to handle this." And in that moment, I realized I had to trust him. Because what came next wasn't just about my sister or her party. It was about the history between us, the hidden grudges, and the secrets that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, Mark tapped his phone and held it up, letting the screen glow faintly under the party lights. "Everyone is going to see why this isn't just about a birthday," he said quietly. The effect was immediate. Guests leaned forward, curiosity mixed with fear, unsure if they were about to witness a family feud or a full-blown scandal. Laura's face tightened. You could almost see her calculating in real time, weighing whether to try to interrupt or just hope the moment would pass. The kids clung to me, Sophie biting her lip to stop herself from crying, Ethan burying his face into my shoulder. I whispered, "Just stay with me," but inside, I was holding my breath too. I knew that whatever Mark was about to show would change the dynamic of our family forever. This wasn't just confrontation. This was revelation. And for the first time, I saw Laura's armor crack, just slightly, as the room braced itself for what everyone knew was coming next, but no one could guess exactly what it would be. And then Mark said it, a line so quiet that only I could hear, "You thought this would be easy, didn't you?" The way he said it made it clear. The party, the smug attitude, the humiliation, it was about to backfire in a way Laura would never forget. And just like that, the entire room was on edge, holding its collective breath. The kids clung to me tighter. Guests stared, frozen. Laura looked like she was ready to speak, but couldn't. And I realized, with a chill running down my spine, that what was coming next would leave everyone in shock, and no one, absolutely no one, would see it coming. The moment Mark tapped his phone, the room shifted. People leaned in instinctively, the air thick with anticipation. You could feel it. Like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for a bomb to drop. And in a way, that's exactly what was about to happen. Mark's calm demeanor made it worse. There was no hesitation, no panic, only this quiet, terrifying confidence. Laura's eyes darted between him and the screen, a flicker of fear crossing her face that I hadn't seen before. Her smugness had cracked. Just slightly, but enough to give me hope that maybe, finally, the tables were turning. He swiped, and suddenly the screen was showing something that made my stomach drop. A court document. Custody agreements, formal rulings, emails from lawyers. The kind of evidence that proves things you never thought anyone would bring up in front of a room full of neighbors and friends. Mark didn't just wave it vaguely. He held it up where everyone could see, making sure it caught the light just enough to reveal the words. Laura had been in a legal dispute over visitation arrangements, over parental responsibilities, even over decisions about school and medical care. And in that dispute, it was crystal clear that her behavior toward Sophie and Ethan wasn't just unfair, it was consistent, deliberate, and documented. You could hear the gasps, the murmurs spreading like wildfire. Some guests covered their mouths, some leaned closer to read for themselves. Laura's husband, Richard, shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to disappear into the floor. I could see her mind working, the wheels turning fast, calculating damage control, but there wasn't any control left. Mark didn't just present the document, he framed it with context. He explained, calmly, fact by fact, how Laura had tried to interfere in my children's lives, subtly and overtly, over the past few years. And the thing that hit hardest? The pattern. Every innocent exclusion, every cutting remark, every subtly judgmental comment at family gatherings suddenly made sense. It wasn't personal. It was deliberate. Systematic. And everyone in that room could see it now. My kids weren't the problem. Laura's behavior was. Sophie and Ethan clung to me tighter as whispers filled the room. "I didn't know," one neighbor murmured. "I thought she was just," another voice trailed off. I could feel my own rage simmering, a slow burn that matched the tight knot in my chest. All those tiny injustices over the years, they weren't little. They were pieces of a puzzle Mark was now laying out in plain view. Laura opened her mouth, trying to interject, but Mark didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't yell. He just swiped again, showing another email, another document, a record of every attempt she had made to exclude my kids. The room leaned in further. Every guest was invested, every eye glued to the screen, and every second made Laura's posture collapse just a little more. I wanted to cry, not from fear or embarrassment, but from relief. Relief that my children weren't at fault, that the invisible weight of her judgment was finally being named. And yet, the humiliation of the party itself, the public exposure, the sharp stares, the whispered judgments from aunts and neighbors, was still real. But at least now it wasn't our fault. Mark paused, letting the weight of what he'd revealed sink in. And then, like a surgeon, he delivered the final strike. He read one line aloud, slow, deliberate, and with that perfect, icy calm that only he has. Attempts to exclude the minor children of Emily Smith from social and familial events are documented and constitute deliberate interference in parental rights. The room went silent. Even Clara, my niece, looked up from the cupcakes as if sensing the shift in the air. Guests froze. Some leaned back, incredulous. Some whispered, shaking their heads. And Laura, oh Laura. She looked like someone had dropped a bucket of ice water over her. Her carefully curated facade, her smug confidence, her sense of control, all crumbling in the span of a few minutes. Richard tried to speak, to apologize or explain, but Mark held up his hand. He didn't yell, he didn't argue. He just said something that made everyone lean closer. There's more you need to know. And then, without warning, he pulled up one final piece of evidence. A photo, time-stamped and documented, showing Clara playing at a park while Sophie and Ethan were deliberately excluded from a group activity, an outing Laura had organized with other neighborhood kids. The evidence was undeniable. The moment it appeared on the screen, the room collectively shifted, like a wave had washed over them all. I looked down at Sophie and Ethan, and I swear, for the first time that day, they relaxed slightly. Relief mixed with awe in their wide eyes. They could see that someone was standing up for them, someone was finally proving that the rejection, the words, the subtle cruelties, they weren't their fault. Laura's face had gone pale. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words, but nothing came out. You could see her mind racing, desperately searching for an escape, a way to regain control, a way to justify herself, but there wasn't one. Not here. Not now. And for a moment, the silence was so thick you could hear the party lights humming in the background. And just when I thought the room had reached its peak, Mark said it. You thought this would stay hidden. That we wouldn't notice. That our children wouldn't see how you treated them. But we did. And now everyone knows. The room didn't erupt into chaos, not yet. But the tension was palpable. The whispers turned into sharp glances. Some people nodded in understanding, some looked horrified, and some, like Laura, looked like they might vanish on the spot. My heart was still racing, but I felt a strange calm wash over me. The truth was finally out, and my children were no longer the ones on trial. But before anyone could react further, Laura's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smirk. And I knew. Just knew that whatever she had planned next, whatever she was thinking in that tiny pause, it was going to make the next moment even more shocking. The tension in the room wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And what came next would leave everyone, including me, completely speechless. The room felt heavier after the evidence. It wasn't just the glow of Mark's phone or the court documents, it was the shift in energy. Guests who had been politely sipping punch or nibbling on cupcakes were now leaning in, murmuring to each other, exchanging looks that said, I can't believe this is happening at a kid's birthday party. And my sister, Laura, was trying to regain control, but every gesture felt smaller, weaker, like a fire burning at the edge of a wet log. Richard, her husband, attempted to speak first. Emily, Mark, maybe we should, he started, but Mark didn't flinch. He raised his hand, his eyes never leaving Laura. No, Richard. This needs to be clear. Everyone here deserves to see the truth. The room went silent again, the children clinging to me, sensing the adult storm around them. Sophie peeked around my leg, eyes wide, while Ethan's tiny hands fidgeted nervously in mine. They didn't understand the legal documents or the emails, but they understood the tension, the unspoken weight that something terrible and thrilling had just been revealed. Laura's first instinct was to attack, to try to shame me for daring to bring the party into public humiliation. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, her face twisted as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative had fallen apart. Every guest, every neighbor, every friend was watching. She couldn't manipulate or gaslight anyone in this room anymore. The armor she had built over years of subtle dominance was crumbling, brick by brick, in front of the very people she wanted to impress. Mark didn't stop with the documents. He added context, layer by layer, drawing connections that had been invisible to everyone before. He reminded the room of the small, seemingly innocuous incidents. Birthday invites that never came for Sophie and Ethan, playdates that were canceled last minute without reason, subtle comments about how my children didn't fit in socially. At first, it seemed trivial, but framed against the cold, hard facts of the court documents, these minor slights formed a pattern: deliberate exclusion, public humiliation, and calculated emotional manipulation. And the guests reacted. Aunt Jean, who had been sipping her drink quietly, leaned forward and muttered, "I never realized. She's been doing this for years." Others nodded, whispering their own confirmations. The room buzzed with quiet realization. Laura's power over perception, over social judgment, over what people believed about her family, had finally been broken. And she didn't like it. But the most intense part? The children. Sophie and Ethan had been watching closely. Their small hands gripped mine tightly, but their expressions changed as they saw someone, Mark, fighting for them, proving they weren't the problem. For the first time that day, I saw relief in their eyes. Relief mixed with pride. Relief mixed with awe. They understood, on some deep, instinctual level, that truth had been served, and justice, however small and imperfect, had been delivered in their corner. Laura, though, wasn't done yet. She leaned toward me, her voice low, venomous, trying to sound calm, but failing. "You think this makes you better than me?" she hissed. The words were sharp, but they were a whisper against the roar of stunned witnesses. Mark didn't even flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, and in that small gesture, the room understood. Laura no longer controlled the narrative. She didn't get the satisfaction of victory. Clara, my niece, wandered toward the cupcakes, oblivious to the tension, but even she seemed to sense that something had shifted. The dynamic of the party, the cheerful laughter, the light chatter, had been replaced by a new order. And that order wasn't in Laura's favor. My children could move freely now, no longer shrinking into the corner, no longer feeling shame for being who they were. But then, just as I thought the worst was behind us, Laura leaned toward Richard and whispered something so quietly that only I caught it. "This isn't over." My stomach dropped. Every guest in the room felt the tension in that tiny murmur. It was a warning, a promise, a threat. She wasn't done scheming, not by a long shot. And in that instant, I realized that the victory, as satisfying as it was only temporary. Mark, sensing the shift, tapped his phone again. "We'll see," he said, voice calm, deliberate. The implication was clear. Whatever Laura thought she could plan next, whatever games she hoped to play, we were ready. And the room felt it. There was a collective exhale of tension, but the edge remained. Suspense lingered, heavy and electric. I looked down at Sophie and Ethan. They were smiling slightly now, shy, but relieved. They knew they were safe in that moment. And for a second, I allowed myself to feel hope. But then I glanced at Laura, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressed tightly together, and I realized that this family feud, this public showdown, was far from over. The fallout would echo beyond the party, beyond the neighbors, even beyond this one room. And that's when I realized the cruel irony. A birthday party, a day that should have been pure joy, laughter, and cake had become a battlefield. Every decoration, every cheerful balloon, every song playing in the background was now a backdrop for a war of dignity, truth, and justice. And the craziest part? My children didn't just survive it. They were learning something I hadn't expected, that sometimes the world is unfair, people are cruel, and yet there are moments when truth and courage can turn everything upside down. And just as the tension seemed to plateau, Laura's lips curled into the faintest smirk. The tiniest, most chilling smirk. She leaned in slightly, a whisper meant only for me, and said, "You think this is over? Just wait." I froze. The room fell into an almost imperceptible pause, the kind of pause where everyone senses a storm about to hit, but no one knows exactly what form it will take. And in that instant, I realized whatever came next would make this day unforgettable for everyone. The room finally began to settle, though the tension still lingered like smoke after a fire. Guests murmured quietly, some excusing themselves, others lingering as if they couldn't leave without processing what had just happened. Sophie and Ethan clung to me, their small bodies trembling, not from fear this time, but from the adrenaline of witnessing something they barely understood but instinctively recognized, that the adults around them could be cruel, and yet justice could prevail. I squeezed their hands, feeling both relief and exhaustion. Mark put his phone down, leaning against the table with that quiet, steady authority of his. I glanced at him, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself a tiny smile. We had done what we needed to do. We had protected our children, shown the truth, and exposed the hypocrisy that Laura had hidden behind her perfect party facade for years. But the calm was temporary. I knew it. Laura's whisper, "This isn't over," still echoed in my mind. I looked around at the guests. Their expressions were a mix of sympathy, shock, and admiration. Some whispered to each other, confirming things they had noticed, but never dared to confront before. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, trying to comprehend the fact that a birthday party had turned into a revelation of long-hidden family conflict. The energy in the room was electric, heavy with realization and moral tension. And through it all, my children began to relax. Sophie's fingers unclenched from my arm, and Ethan's tiny body stopped trembling as he peeked over the edge of the table, his eyes filled with curiosity instead of fear. It was in that moment that I realized the real lesson of the day. Family can be complicated. Relationships can be messy. And people you expect to support you, sometimes even siblings, can shock you with cruelty you never anticipated. But courage, truth, and standing up for what is right can rewrite the rules. Even in a room full of judgment, a few brave choices can change the narrative entirely. And in that moment, I knew that Sophie and Ethan had learned something invaluable, that being treated unfairly isn't a reflection of who they are, but a reflection of the other person's choices. Laura, meanwhile, was trying to maintain composure. She wasn't crying, she wasn't yelling, at least not yet, but I could see the storm behind her eyes. Her lips were pressed tight, her jaw tense, and every so often she glanced at Richard, as if silently demanding reassurance. But the truth was out and she couldn't take it back. No clever words, no passive-aggressive gestures, no fake smiles could undo the revelation Mark had delivered. The room had witnessed her strategy fail in real time. I couldn't help but think about how ironic it all was. A birthday party, a moment meant for celebration and laughter, had become a courtroom of truth. But in that irony, there was also empowerment. My children had been shielded from the brunt of the cruelty, yet they had seen strength, fairness, and courage in action. They had learned that justice doesn't always come quietly, it sometimes comes in moments that leave everyone stunned. And I hoped, deeply, that they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. Mark reached out, brushing Sophie's hair back gently and whispering something to her that made her giggle quietly. Ethan, still clinging to me, peeked at Mark's calm face and seemed reassured. I realized then that we hadn't just survived this party, we had won a small but important victory. We had reclaimed our dignity, exposed the truth, and reminded everyone, including ourselves, that cruelty has limits and courage has power. But even as the relief settled, Laura's presence reminded me that this wasn't truly over. Her small, chilling smirk, the one that had appeared just before she whispered her threat, lingered in my memory. She was biding her time, planning her next move, calculating how to regain her perceived control. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the fallout from this day would extend far beyond the walls of that living room. She had been humbled, yes, but she wasn't defeated entirely. That battle, I suspected, was only beginning. I looked down at Sophie and Ethan, my heart swelling with pride and love. "You're safe," I whispered to them, and they smiled faintly, trusting the reassurance. For now, that was enough. For now, we had endured, survived, and even triumphed in a small way. But I also knew that family, like life, rarely gives clean victories. The storm might have paused, but it was never truly gone. And just like the smoke that lingers after a fire, Laura's presence, her threat, her unresolved fury, it would linger too. And as the guests began to leave, murmuring condolences or polite encouragements, I found a strange sense of peace. Sophie and Ethan laughed softly, their eyes bright, their fear replaced with curiosity and resilience. I knew that, whatever came next, they had seen strength, justice, and courage firsthand. And for me, that was the true victory of the day. Proving that family bonds don't have to be defined by cruelty, and that even in the darkest moments, truth can shine through. And yet, as I gathered the last of the party supplies and held my children close, Laura's faint whisper echoed again in my mind. "This isn't over." The words, soft but deliberate, were a chilling reminder that while today's battle had been won, the war, emotional, familial, and personal, was far from over. And in that instant, I realized that our story, our family, had entered a new chapter, one that would test courage, patience, and resolve in ways we hadn't yet imagined.